Excited to be here and to have a chance to discuss a little bit about our journey that we've taken. So what I'd like to have you do is to consider a phone call. You receive a phone call from your mother, and she says, "We've had increased concerns about Dad. We took him to the doctor today, and the doctor thinks that he might have early stages of dementia or some type of memory loss." This is an interesting question because my colleagues and I routinely will be at a party, at a dinner party or at a cocktail party, and we will announce what we do for our work. And we'll get so many questions coming up about my mother and my father, my aunt is having these increased difficulties with memory concerns. And it probably is one of the most pressing and concerning issues that's facing older adults these days, is that idea of, will I maintain my cognitive abilities and will I encounter some form of dementia as I age? And so as an individual encounters that call, then we are launched onto this very unexpected journey. And even though we're getting more information about Alzheimer's disease, and it's becoming more common in the sort of societal conversation, still there's so many unanswered questions about the process and the journey and how are we going to navigate this process. So the basic ideas that are the foundation for this app that we're developing came out of our clinical practice. So we've developed this concept called proactive dementia care, which is the integration of health education and social work services at the point of diagnosis in a specialty neurology clinic. And this is an innovative shift because basically, routinely, psychosocial interventions for individuals with dementia are delayed for years. So people would say, even if they were able to get an effective diagnosis, they would not potentially seek additional guidance and support for that care trajectory until crises began to occur. So our hope is to be able to integrate that. And we've been doing this in our practice to be able to guide families proactively and preventatively through this process because we know a lot about the steps that will occur. So that's our primary concept. And so what we encountered, the next step we encountered was a RFP for services for dementia caregivers, and through an NIH grant. And so initially we thought maybe we'll develop a manual. And there's so many manuals. You can go and there's lots of books about this. And so fairly quickly we shifted our plan in order to develop a innovative and a individualized and interactive application that could actually help that individual that's at that critical moment of what do we do now, to be able to say, first of all, is this a problem? So it's not a diagnostic tool, but it's to say, should we seek help? Did we get an effective evaluation? Because one of the big concerns in clinical practice these days is that an individual might have a brief conversation with the primary care physician and do minimal testing and then begin an individual on Aricept or another dementia-related medication without that formal evaluation. So did we get an effective diagnosis? And then also, what are these stepwise, well understood red flag concerns about this disease process? And so what we're trying to do is integrate that into this application. And as we did this, one of the things we encountered, I appreciate your comments, that we are very new at this as well. And so we actually met with TVC. They were very helpful in helping us establish our company. It felt to me, and this is like an adult game of Monopoly. So it's like, you're the vice president and you have 10,000 shares. It just felt sort of like, because I have really no business expertise or background whatsoever. So it was very interesting to try and walk through that process. And so we did decide on going to utilize this in an app approach rather than trying to do this in a manual format. So again, the other question we looked at is what's the appropriate format even in an app basis? So would we target a telephone base? Would we target a tablet? Or would we do this a web application? So one of our hopes was to make this as mobile as possible. So what we decided on was to try and target a tablet-based format that could also be accessed through an app, but also, through a phone, but also having a web-based presence as well. And so that's what we decided on. We've started to work toward that. We also tried to decide what's the right funding approach. And we did apply for an STTR Phase 1 grant, which we actually received. And that helped us to be able to have the several phases that we would go through to help us guide that process. The other thing that's been very important is coming up with the right partnerships. And it was interesting to try and decide what were our lacks. We lacked the business expertise. We certainly lacked the ability to create computer-based applications. And so we went through several iterations trying to get the right team put together. The other thing we found is that we needed to have this dogged persistence. So we actually received our Phase 1 STDR funding in 2012. So we received $127,000 Phase 1 funding. And the iterations since that have been quite a process for us. Back to that labyrinth we talked about earlier. Been quite a process. And so we applied for Phase 2 funding, and we did not receive the funding. And so we got feedback, and we actually developed a follow-up Phase 2 application. And then it was interesting, we actually had an advocate at NIH, and we ended up getting our initial grant funded finally, but it's taken us this long. We just had our Phase 2 STTR funding in November of 2016. So it's been this quite a complicated process to get to where we are now. The other challenge is pacing. So the pace we've been going on is snail's pace compared to the way that, again, I'm not an IT expert in any way, but the pace of app development, the pace that these things proceed is on light speed, and we've been kind of crawling along at this slow pace. And so it's been a real challenge for us to be able to, again, get on the right pace. And finally, it feels like we've got the right team players involved. So one of the lessons we've learned is that we really had to look at what are all these areas where we did not have that expertise. So we needed to have fairly extensive business support. So we were able to work with the business school. Troy D'Ambrosio has been a key contact and has been involved in our project and given us some of that business guidance. And with the Phase 2 funding, we've been able to actually hire 2 full-time, they're here in the back, 2 full-time project managers, which actually has finally been able to put us on an appropriate time frame to proceed with this development, this application. The other thing we found is that these are 2 widely diverse universes. So basically, we've got Dr. Foster as our primary neurologist on our team, and myself. This being in an academic setting with this extensive academic demands does not allow us to be able to dedicate the time necessary to be able to see this really through as quickly as we need to. So having the project managers has been very helpful. One other thing I'd say about the STTR versus the SBIR, we actually debated about those 2 applications. I'm not sure you're familiar with the differences, but the challenge we ran into with the SBIR application was that it required one of the primary kind of PIs on it to be at least at 51% engaged in the business aspect of that process, which was just not realistic for Dr. Foster or myself. And so it feels like, again, we finally got the right team. We've got a good collaboration with Visis, which is a company that's through SKI here at the University of Utah. And I think we've made, again, considerably more rapid progress in the last few months than we have in the last several years. So it's been quite an ordeal. And I just want to highlight the team that we have put together. Again, Dr. Foster is our primary clinical lead, myself, and the kind of more in the psychosocial interventions. One thing I also forgot to mention in the lessons learned was we had several of our key players leave the university during this process. And not only do we have to try and deal with them as far as the content they took away with them, But we also had to deal with the fact that they were owners of the company. And so we get just the layers of the complexity of having to deal with the company aspects of this, but also the content was quite challenging. And thank you.